Hello and welcome back to this video series on the Chocolatey for Business Quick Deployment Environment, or QDE. I am Adil from Chocolatey, and in this video I'll be walking you through how to set up QDE on a HyperV host. So in the interest of time, I've gone ahead and pre-downloaded the two types of HyperV files provided as links in the QDE email received from the Chocolatey team. And these are the Quick Deployment HyperV Appliance and the Quick Deployment VHD Disk. Now I've gone ahead and expanded both of those archives, and we can go in here and see the Choco server folder for the HyperV appliance. In the case of VHD, we just have the VHD disk itself. So let's go ahead and see how we can set up QDE using HyperV in both these two methods. So we'll start with the HyperV appliance because it's a little bit simpler. I'm going to go ahead and drag this Choco server folder to my desktop to make it a little simpler for me. And then we'll go from there. So in my HyperV manager, I'm going to go ahead and choose the action menu and select import virtual machine. This is just a next, and I'm choosing browse, and I'm going to my desktop here, and I'm just picking the Choco server folder, which is my HyperV appliance. I'm going to select this folder, I'm going to click next, and I'm going to go ahead and choose the first option, leave it that way to register the virtual machine in place. And I'll just click finish here. And so now that I've imported my HyperV appliance, as with any of these images, there are three main virtual hardware components that I need to configure. And that's CPU, memory, and disk. So let's go ahead and configure those. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and go to settings, and I'll go to memory first. I'm actually going to change this value to 8192, which is the actual calculation of 8 gigs. And in the processor, I'm going to crank this up to 4. Which is the recommended amount for QDE. Now this hard drive, I don't have the mechanism of increasing the size right into here right now, but I'm going to go ahead and hit OK and save those two settings. So I'm going to go ahead and open up PowerShell in an administrative window here, and I'm going to go ahead and browse to the folder where the VHD is. In this case, it's Choco Server Virtual Hard Disks Quick Deployment Environment.vhd. So I'm going to go ahead and browse to that folder by going to CD, Desktop, Choco Servers, and Virtual Hard Disks. And in here, I'm going to run a command to resize this VHD, specifically to 100 gigabytes. Now, 100 gigabytes is the recommended minimum that we say to expand it to. You can always expand it to larger than that if you choose to. So that's not the command that I was looking to type. Let me copy this again and paste this in here. So I'm going to go ahead and resize this VHD. The path is the Quick Deploy Environment VHD because we're in the correct folder already, and the size is 100 gigabytes. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and there you go. So now I can see I do have my VHD here, and it has been resized, and we can see that in the OS. So I'm going to close out this PowerShell window and come back here, and now that I've configured my CPU, my memory, and my disk, I can go ahead and power on this VM now and start configuring it within the OS. And now that I'm in the OS, I can go ahead and log in. And now this password, as I've mentioned before in the other videos, is included in the QDE email that had the links to the QDE images. So this should have been provided to you ahead of time. So of course this is a temporary password, and I'm going to go ahead and reset it to a version that's compliant with the minimum settings for Windows Server. And we'll go ahead and change that, and once that's ready, we'll go ahead and log in. Okay, excellent. Now we're into our Choco server. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and right click the start menu and go into disk management, because I want to double check that my disk is the right size. So I did expand it at the hypervisor level to 100 gigs, but you can see that it hasn't been extended in the OS level yet. So I'll go ahead and right click and extend this volume. I'll click next, finish, and I should have it now expanded, which is excellent. And as I've mentioned before, there are certain services and applications that run on this VM, whereas if you do not provide them with enough space, they will not work properly, specifically your Nexus repository. And now you can see I have that 99.4 gigs, so almost that full 100 gigs available for me now, which is great. Okay, so now let's look at how to set up the Choco server using the VHD method, which is the virtual hard disk. So I'll go back into my images folder here, and you can see that I've extracted that VHD, and we'll go into here and we can find we have the Quick Deploy Environment VHD right there in the images folder on my desktop. So let's go ahead and build this VM using the VHD disk method. So I'm going to go ahead and right click my HyperV host here, and I'm going to go to the new virtual machine option. And in here I'm just going to click next, and I'm going to go ahead and name my virtual machine Choco Server, and I'm going to click next here. I'm going to choose the generation 1 virtual machine. This is very important because we need to configure the virtual hardware to be legacy hardware compliant. So please pick generation 1, and in the startup memory we're going to give this 8192 as before, which is 8 gigs. And I'm going to click next. Under this networking menu, whatever your default switch is, you can go ahead and pick that, or whatever networking you prefer. In the create virtual hard disk menu, so we'll use an existing virtual hard disk first of all. We'll go over here to our desktop now, we'll look under images, and we'll select that VHD disk that we had already downloaded. So we'll click next here, and now we've got our generation 1 Choco server with 8 gigs of RAM using that VHD disk, and we'll click finish. And you'll see here now we have this other version of the Choco server from the VHD method, and I'll right click this and select settings because we need to configure that memory and processor again to just ensure that they're right. Now of course already we have configured that memory, but the processor we do need to bump up to the 4 CPUs, and I'm going to go ahead and hit OK to apply that setting. In addition, as we did before with the HyperV appliance method, we need to grow this VHD disk. So I'm going to go ahead and use PowerShell to do that. So in PowerShell, I'm going to need to browse to the images folder on my desktop, to the quick deployment environment VHD folder, and expand this VHD. So I'm going to open up PowerShell. You can see I've already browsed to that individual folder. I've done a list, and I can see I have the quick deployment environment VHD here, and I'm going to go ahead and just resize this VHD to 100 gigabytes using the same command that I did for the appliance. And now that disk has been resized at the hypervisor level. Now remember, we still have to do that at the OS level. So let's go ahead and start up our Choco server here. So I'm going to go ahead and click start, and we'll let it power up. Okay, and again, as with all our other methods, when we're importing images, we have to put in a temporary password when we first boot up the VM. Now this temporary password was provided to you in the QDE email, where you got the QDE link for the images to download as well. And I'm going to go ahead and type this temporary password in now, and of course that password needs to be changed. So I'm going to type in the password that meets the complexity requirements for Windows Server 2019 in this case, and we'll be off to the races. And I've completed that, and now we can log into the VM. Excellent. So first things first, of course, I'm going to go in and right click the start menu. I'm going to go to disk management, and I'm going to go ahead and extend this volume. As you can see, again, we have expanded the disk. We have resized the disk in the hypervisor level, but it hasn't been extended in here. So we're going to go ahead and right click and extend this volume. Next, finish. And there you go. Now it's extended. And now we know that all of the components of QDE will work properly because they have the proper disk space as shown here, which is excellent. Okay, and now we've seen how on a HyperV host we can configure the HyperV virtual appliance as well as the HyperV VHD disk method to create our QDE VM. And now that our VM's been set up, we can go ahead and explore the features within QDE, such as the Nexus Repository Manager, the Jenkins automation, as well as Chocolatey Central Management.